Welcome to this lesson. We're going to walk through the exam guide so we can see what we can expect when we take our exam. Let's have a quick lesson breakdown. The first thing we'll do is we'll go over our response types. So this is where we'll talk about what kind of questions we'll see. We'll look at the previous exam domains, and then using that, we'll talk about the difference in the new exam domains. After talking about the differences between the two exams, we'll start looking at each domain individually and see what we really need to know to become an expert in those said domains. And then we'll wrap everything up with some exam tips. So let's take a look at the response types. The first question you'll get is a scenario-based response. So a large majority of the questions on the exam will be based on real-world scenarios. So you really need to do well in picking out keywords and requirements in these scenarios to pick the best answer for it. There will also be multiple choice questions. So there will be one correct response and usually 3 incorrect responses, which are known as distractors. Now, these distractors are written usually in a way that makes them seem as if they can be correct. However, they are not. There's always at least one thing in each distractor that makes them an incorrect answer based on the scenario in question. And you'll also have multiple response questions. So you'll have to pick 2 correct responses out of 5 response options. Again, this follows the same principle as the multiple choice, where they will likely have distractors for 3 of the incorrect answers. So let's take a look at the previous exam. There were 4 original domains and their breakdowns. We had design resilient architectures at 30%, design high-performing architectures at 28%, design secure applications and architectures, which came in at 24%, and then we finished up with design cost optimized architectures, which weighed in at 18% of the total exam. Well, with this third version of the exam, AWS switched some things up. They moved some weights around and they renamed one of the domains. So now we have design resilient architectures at 26%. We have design high-performing architectures, which is now at 24%. And they renamed the secure architecture domain to design secure architectures, which weighs in at 30%. So there's a big emphasis on this particular domain now. And then lastly, they kept design cost optimized architectures and they bumped it up to 20%. So you can see they moved some of the weights around and then they renamed this one domain. So what can we expect in the design resilient architectures domain questions? Well, a lot of the questions you're going to encounter are based around designing multi-tier architecture solutions. So how can you make them scalable or loosely coupled and multi-tiered? You also need to know how you can design highly available and or fault-tolerant architectures. You need to know the key differences between being highly available and fault-tolerant, and we'll cover those throughout this course. You also need to know how you can design decoupling mechanisms using different services. So when you use message queuing or notification topics within your architectures. And lastly, you need to know when you need to choose the appropriate resilient storage. So what are the requirements for your storage? How often is data accessed, etc. Now let's move on to designing high-performing architectures. In this, we need to know how we can identify elastic and scalable compute solutions for our workloads. So things like auto-scaling groups or elastic load balancers for handling and dispersing load. We need to know how we can select high-performing and scalable storage solutions for workloads as well. You also need to know how to select the best high-performing networking solution for your workload. So will VPN cut it, or do you need something like a direct connect? And lastly, you need to know which database solution fits your workload best. So do you need a non-relational database like DynamoDB? Do you need something more like Amazon Redshift, etc.? Now let's move on to designing secure architectures. This is the newly named domain, but it follows similar concepts as the previous exam. You'll need to know how you can design secure access to AWS resources. So things like IAM, AWS single sign-on, things of that nature. You need to know how you can design secure application tiers. We also need to know how to select appropriate data security options. So think of things like encryption at rest and in transit, for instance. And then the last domain, design cost-optimized architectures. We're going to explore how we can identify cost-effective storage solutions. So maybe different tiers in S3 storage, for example. We're going to look at how we can identify the most cost-effective compute and database services. So Aurora serverless, maybe Spot instances for EC2, different things like that. We'll also look at designing cost-optimized network architectures. Now, let's move on to our exam tip. So what does it take to pass? Well, your result on the exam is going to be a score from 100 all the way to 1000. The minimum pass mark is 720. So as long as you score 720 points out of 1000, you officially reach this certification. There are 65 questions, and you're going to have 130 minutes to complete the exam, so be sure to pace yourself correctly. Now, we also wanted to pass along some testing tips. We recommend not spending too much time on your hard questions at first. Select an answer, flag them, and then review them later on. Be sure to watch for keyword indicators in certain scenarios. There's going to be very specific keywords that make the difference in which service you should choose. And lastly, always remember the well-architected framework pillars. These have a big play in a lot of the scenario answers. Now that's going to do it for this lesson. Let's go ahead and wrap up, and then we'll start getting into the course.